southeastern Alaska, in what is today Sitka Sound, Alaska, June 27, 1802. At about 1 o'clock in the afternoon, as a young Russian named Ambrosium Plotnikov returns from checking his cattle that are grazing near one of the inlets near Sitka Bay, he hears a series of loud, blood-curdling screams. He rushes back over the ridge separating the stream from Sitka Bay and is greeted with what is undoubtedly a horrifying sight. Roughly 60 Tlingit war canoes coming around the point of the bay and heading straight for the Russian settlement of St. Michael the Archangel. These are spruce war canoes, carved with ornate designs and carrying dozens of bear and wolfskin-clad Tlingit warriors, their faces painted black all around the eyes to give them a fierce, ghastly appearance, even in the midday sun. They are armed with spears, bows, arrows, and a considerable amount of firearms, many of which have been acquired via trade, whether directly or indirectly, with Russian merchants. The warriors paddle deftly in the turbulent bay waters that incessantly give Russian oarsmen many difficulties, and when they reach land, they disperse like the packs of wolves they have named their warrior order after, the Wolf Clan. These are experienced warriors who have conducted countless raids like this one. But on this day, this target is particularly valuable, not only because of the captives that can be taken and either ransomed or used as slaves, but also for the supplies and weapons that are here. And, last but not least, this raid will send a larger message to these intruders from the west, who have come to trade with their enemies, to steal their land, and to empty their streams. These warriors intend to send a message so brutal that it will be carried back to the chief of these foreigners, and he will finally decide to end his subjects' forays into lands that are not theirs. Now, Ambrosium Plotnikov and his fellow inhabitants here at this small Russian outpost will pay the price for their incursion into Alaska. Unfortunately for him, he is but a poor Russian peasant, in many ways as much a victim of Russian imperialism as those whose territory he has encroached on. He is a day laborer who has either desperately fled a terrible situation at home or been forced into work for an expeditionary party due to his low social status. He can exercise no effect on geopolitical policy, nor can he hope to combat several dozen canoes full of Tlingit warriors. All the young Russian can do now is hope to save his own life. Initially, he makes a dash for the shared living quarters of the workers, but, to his frustration, finds it locked and empty. With no time to investigate, Plotnikov makes a mad dash for the stables where he keeps a loaded rifle for just such instances as these. As Tlingit warriors begin to swarm the village, their animal head-shaped helmets giving the illusion of wolves, ravens, and Kodiak bears rushing about the camp in a whirlwind of violence, intent on exacting revenge on these unrepentant intruders, Plotnikov reaches the stables and grabs his weapons. As stealthily as he can, he begins to move about the stables, fortifying positions under the windows in an effort to construct some kind of ad hoc defensive position. As he moves to the furthest, darkest corner of the stables, he is startled to discover a mother and child hiding in the shadows. They are understandably terrified, with the young mother frozen in fear. Plotnikov tells the woman to flee into the nearby woods and to hide, telling her that he will stay in the stables and cover her retreat. The woman and child do as he suggests, and flee to the comparative darkness and concealment of the thick boreal forest that surrounds the settlement on 3 sides. Meanwhile, Plotnikov uses what fleeting moments he has to continue to reinforce his position and lock down the doors. In a short time, the Tlingit warriors have made their way through the settlement, and now 4 of them have turned their ire on the stables, attempting to gain access by demanding that the door be opened. When their commands are not obeyed, they simply bash the door in. They seize Plotnikov by his heavy coat and take his gun. However, as the warriors struggle to subdue the Russian, he manages to slip out of his coat and make a mad dash for the woods. His pursuers quickly abandon their chase, seeing the bounty of supplies in the stables as far more enticing than one additional dead Russian. As the raid continues to unfold, they ransack the stables, taking great glee in the plunder of its bounty. Meanwhile, after hiding in the shadows of the woods for a few hours and being incessantly tormented by the screams of his dying countrymen in combination with the exhortation of the Tlingit raiders, Plotnikov, unable to remain still any longer, makes his way back to the fort, cautiously scurrying from the cover of one tree to the next before laying eyes on the end stages of the sudden horror that had just been wrought upon the small contingent of Russians. His description of the events is as follows. I returned to a point near the fort and found all the buildings on fire, except the warehouse of which the Indians had possession, and from which they were throwing furs, provisions, etc., out through the windows and carrying them to the canoes which had been brought for the purpose of taking them away. I saw one of our men jump through a window of one of the burning buildings, only to be picked up on the fighting knives of the savages and thrown back into the fire. I also saw them cut off another man's head and throw the headless body into the flames. Unfortunately for Plotnikov, before he can fully digest the totality of the scene in front of him, he is spotted by two Tlingit warriors who chase after him in what must have been a truly terrifying pursuit for the Russian. Plotnikov again manages to hide in the forest for a nerve-rattling few hours before making a second attempt to survey the ruins of the settlement. By this time, the screams have abated, and the scene that greets the young explorer is one of a macabre, hellish nightmare. Except, in this case, it is all too real. The buildings are all still on fire, and the ground now littered with the bodies of his comrades. Plotnikov notices that some of the cattle he had been watering earlier that very afternoon are now milling about outside of the settlement. Many of the unfortunate bovines have Tlingit knives embedded deep in various spots about their bodies. He now attempts to make his way to the animals in hope of at least providing them with some relief, when he is again spotted and again pursued into the woods by the remnants of the Tlingit raiding party. After his narrowest escape yet, Plotnikov takes shelter under a large tree and spends a shiftless, terrifying night alone in the Alaskan dark, trying to keep his breathing quiet and listening intently for the footfalls of more Tlingit warriors. The next morning, he is startled awake by the roar of a group of muskets firing. Again, he flees, this time further up the mountain. On his ascent, he discovers 3 other survivors, another young mother, her child, and an old man who had managed to escape despite being quite ill. This group manages to stay together, hidden from sight for 8 straight days and nights. Each day during this ordeal, Plotnikov ventures down towards the St. Michael's settlement in hopes of finding some kind of relief effort sent by concerned parties in the capital of Kodiak. His fervent hope is that the Russian officials will eventually become concerned at the lack of goods and correspondence coming out of this more easterly settlement. After several days, he finally spots a ship in the distance, making its way towards the site of the settlement. Flush with a mix of panic and joy, Plotnikov dashes out of the dense forest and out onto the rocky strip of beach that stretches out into the bay, his arms outstretched in an effort to hail this presumed rescue boat. But again, Plotnikov is spotted by several Tlingit who have remained in the area and is compelled to again escape into the forest. Again, he hides until dark, then manages to take a more circuitous route to the beach nearest where the large ship has anchored. This time, he is able to alert the men in the boats of what has taken place here. To his surprise, the ship is actually a British vessel, one that has made its way from England, then to Boston, then down around South America, and finally up the Pacific coastline in their pursuit of beaver and otter furs. Regardless, Plotnikov is exceedingly grateful for their rescue of him and his brethren from what they had all presumed to be certain death. He returns to his party with a small guard of English sailors, only to find that in his absence, another survivor has managed to find the mother, child, and old man. This man, a fellow workman named Baturin, is taken with the rest of the party to the relative safety of the British ships. The next day, Plotnikov and Baturin implore the captain to make a trip back into the settlement to both assess the damage and provide their dead with a proper Orthodox funeral. The captain grants their request, again sending a small contingent of armed guards to accompany them. When they reach the ruins of the settlement, they are all now fully able to assess the death and damage that has been wrought upon them by the mighty Tlingit. The headless bodies of men they have lived and worked with, crossed oceans and braved dangers with, celebrated Christmases and feast days with, now lie strewn about the ground like so much refuse. They are given as dignified a burial and funeral as can be managed by the devoutly Orthodox Russian contingent, and then the men make their way back to the British ship that sits waiting in the bay. The ship remains anchored in the harbor for an additional 3 days, as the crew prepares to travel back to Kodiak should no more survivors be found. On the 3rd day, however, a group of Tlingit canoes, seeming to have simply appeared from the ether in their stealth, suddenly paddle up next to the ship. Assuming that they are a British vessel full of Englishmen whose intentions are not to colonize nor to evangelize, but simply to trade for furs. The Tlingit chief asks if they have seen any Russians, in a cryptic attempt to ensure the British have not been informed as to what has happened here at the settlement. The captain, astutely, simply lies and says that they have not. He then invites the chief on board to trade. The chief and his cohort, including his wife, joyfully climb on board the English vessel, excited for the presumably profitable endeavor to come. But as soon as their feet touch down on the ship's deck, the entire Tlingit party are all summarily placed in irons. The remainder of the Tlingits still in the water are informed that their chief will not be returned until all Russian captives have been freed. Furthermore, the Tlingit are informed that if they do not do this, their chief will be hung from the yardarm of the ship. At the same time that this scene is unfolding, 2 more British ships now pull into the bay. All 3 captains of all 3 vessels now join forces in resolutely demanding the return of all hostages. In response, dozens more Tlingit war canoes appear, in a defiant display meant to show that they too mean business should any harm be done to their chief and kinsmen. However, not wanting to see their chief dead at the hands of British sailors, the Tlingit finally bring forth 2 women and 4 children. They insist that these are all the captives that they have, but the British captains all concur that they are lying. And so, the British officers order their crews to open fire upon the Tlingit canoes. In one riotous 3-ship volley, hundreds of Tlingit now fall dead. Many wounded fall back into their canoes, while more fall into the frothing, frigid bay. Those left unscathed now find their newly perforated canoes rapidly sinking. Terrified of further reprisal, the Tlingit on shore now bring forth the remainder of the captives, before quickly making their way north to the cover of the inlets and forests. With their captives safely on board, the British vessels now sail to Kodiak, where their traumatized Russian passengers disembark. Sadly, the individual fates of these survivors, including that of Ambrosium Plotnikov, have been largely lost to history. However, the Russian Empire will not suffer such an affront without exacting their retribution. Plans to exact their revenge on the Tlingit are quickly made. As for the Tlingit, they are all too keenly aware that they have not seen the last of the Russian intruders. And, to be sure, they do not take the threat lightly. They will go on to construct a fort at the inlet of the river into the bay. It is strategically located to spot and intercept any attacks from the Russian ships. One young Tlingit warrior in particular burns for revenge against the Russians. His name is Katlian. He will rise to fame not only for his deeds in war, but for his choice of weaponry. He carries a large blacksmith's hammer, taken from the forge at the St. Michael's settlement. With this hammer in hand, he vows to one day drench its iron head in Russian blood. 2 years later, In 1804, Katlian will have risen to the rank of chief. One day, late in the fall, he will be alerted to the sighting of Russian ships on the horizon. This will mark the beginning of one of the most brutal battles in Alaskan history, the 1804 Battle of Sitka. The Battle of Sitka in 1804 would prove to be a pivotal, climactic battle in this struggle between martial powers in their efforts to control the often inhospitable but perpetually invaluable Alaska coastline. And its consequences reverberate until the present day. But the tales of that battle, as well as the countless occurrences of both conflict and coexistence that have shaped the storied history of Alaska, are, for tonight, other stories for other times. Sitka, Alaska, 1804. Dawn breaks cold and wet over Sitka Sound. The wind smells of spruce and sea salt. A heavy mist rolls off the ocean, clinging to the thick woods that line the shore. Outside a ceremonial plank house deep in the forest, dozens of Tlingit warriors wait, silent and still as stone. Inside, the clan elders confer. At the center of the gathering stands Chief Katlian of the Kiksadi. His face is painted black. Across his chest is a shirt of Chinese silk, layered over armored plates pounded from copper. Katlian is not merely a warrior. He is a symbol. Born into the Kiksadi clan of the Tlingit people, he rose in a time when foreign powers pressed harder each season against the ancient rhythms of life along the Alaskan coast. The son of a noble line within the Raven moiety, Katlian came of age navigating the intricate duties of clan politics, ceremonial obligations, and warfare, all in a world now teetering on the edge of colonization. By the late 1700s, as Russian fur traders encroached deeper into Tlingit territory, Katlian quickly earned a reputation not just for bravery, but for vision. He understood that the Russians brought more than guns and religion. They brought systems of ownership alien to Tlingit law. They sought to seize land, control trade, and undermine the sovereign kinship networks that had governed the clans for centuries. When the Russians built Redoubt St. Archangel Michael in 1799 on Tlingit hunting grounds without permission, it was Katlian who emerged as one of the foremost voices of resistance. Though he had once engaged in trade with Russian agents, ever the pragmatist, he would later help lead the assault that destroyed their fort in 1802, reclaiming the territory and warning the invaders that this land would not be taken easily. That act cemented his name. To the Russians, he was now a dangerous war chief. To his people, he was a leader and a warrior. And now, he is once again at the forefront of the Tlingits' fight. Long before European ships first arrived, the Tlingit had lived along this rugged coastline for generations beyond counting. Their society is rich, hierarchical, and complex, built on lineage, clan identity, trade, and territory. Each clan, such as the Raven and Eagle moieties, is part of an intricate web of alliances and obligations. Their homes are great plank houses carved from cedar. Their stories are passed down in carved totems, in woven robes, and in rhythmic songs carried by drums. They are not a scattered band of foragers, as the Russians believe. They are a confederation of warriors, traders, and diplomats with established laws and fierce loyalty to their lands. Sitka, called Sitka by the Tlingit, is not just a village. It is sacred ground. The forest, the sea, the salmon streams, and the mountain mists, they are not resources. They are ancestors, spirits, guardians, and they are not for sale. The council has made its decision. The Tlingit will not flee. They will not abandon their ancestral land. They will fight to the last man if they must. Already, the new fort that they have built inland, Shiskanao, or Fort of Young Saplings, has been stocked with muskets, black powder, and food stores. Within days of the Tlingit's council, the Russians appear again. Tall ships under foreign flags. The Russian-American Company's fleet, led by Alexander Baranov, has returned. After the Tlingit burned down the old Russian fort 2 years earlier, Baranov, as expected, has come back for revenge, with warships, mercenaries, and Aleut allies at his side. Baranov holds tremendous power and tremendous responsibility. But he was not born into power, nor was he trained for conquest. Alexander Andreevich Baranov came into the world in 1746, in the bustling merchant town of Kargopol, nestled deep in the forests of northern Russia. His father was a modest tradesman, his early education rudimentary. But in a century where empires expanded by sea, and wealth flowed not only through palaces, but through ledgers, Baranov found his footing not with sword or scepter, but with account books, ambition, and audacity. In his youth, Baranov moved to St. Petersburg, the empire's glittering gateway to the west. There, he labored for years as a clerk in merchant offices, absorbing the intricacies of trade, credit, shipping, and profit. He married, raised a family, and carved out a comfortable life. Yet, it was not enough. He wanted more. More independence, more reach, and more opportunity. And for Russian merchants at the close of the 18th century, that meant one thing: Alaska. In 1790, at the age of 44, Baranov took a bold gamble. He accepted a post in the farthest corner of the Russian realm, as chief manager for the Shelikoff-Golikov Company, a private enterprise harvesting the riches of the Pacific coast. The company was already entrenched in the brutal fur trade across Siberia and the Aleutians. Its goal was simple: extract sea otter pelts by any means necessary, then ship them to China, where they sold for a small fortune. Baranov was to expand operations, increase profit, and bring stability to a chaotic frontier. It would become his life's work. The journey to Alaska took over a year. Baranov traveled by land across Siberia, through Kamchatka, and by ship across storm-tossed seas. When he finally arrived in Kodiak, he found a wild, lawless coast racked by conflict. The indigenous Alutiiq and Aleut peoples had been enslaved or conscripted by earlier traders, and revolts were frequent. Supplies were scarce, and weather could destroy a year's fortune in an afternoon. Baranov, a merchant at heart, found himself at the edge of empire and the brink of survival. Yet, he thrived. In a land of hunger, he built storehouses. Where there was violence, he imposed order, often with cruelty. He also constructed schools and Orthodox churches. He established barter networks with native groups and forced hunting quotas onto entire villages. He negotiated with Spanish colonies in California and American traders from Boston. He took a native Alutiiq woman as his second wife and raised children with her. He kept the company alive through famines, through uprisings, and shipwrecks. Within only a few years, Baranov had transformed the enterprise from a tenuous outpost into the backbone of Russia's North American holdings. When Tsar Paul I rechartered the company in 1799 as the Russian-American Company, it was granted monopoly rights and imperial sanction. The firm became a de facto government, and Baranov, though never noble, never titled, became its unchallenged overlord. From his base in Kodiak, he ruled a territory larger than Europe. His word was law from the Bering Sea to the Pacific Northwest. But Baranov had a flaw. He knew the fur trade depended on conquest, and conquest demanded expansion. By 1799, he had pushed into Tlingit territory in southeastern Alaska, a land rich in salmon, timber, and otter pelts. And it was that year, without permission, that he had ordered the construction of Redoubt St. Archangel Michael. The move enraged the local HOKC'S clan, but Baranov was unmoved. However, Baranov had underestimated them, and he had paid the price. In 1802, the Tlingit warriors had destroyed the fort, killed the garrison, and reclaimed their land. It was a humiliating blow, one that tarnished his image back in St. Petersburg. For Baranov, the defeat at Sitka was personal. It threatened not just the company's future, but his own authority. He had spent the next 2 years rallying resources, petitioning the imperial court, ordering supplies, conscripting Aleut hunters, and recruiting ships. Now, in 1804, at nearly 60 years old, he leads a military expedition back to Sitka to crush the Tlingit resistance once and for all. The 22-gun frigate Neva, a veteran of global voyages, is placed under Captain Yuri Lysansky, a man with experience but little taste for frontier war. Baranov also gathered hundreds of fighting men, Russians, Siberian Cossacks, and dozens of Aleut hunters conscripted from earlier campaigns. They brought with them muskets, cannons, iron tools, and Orthodox priests. But what Baranov truly hopes to bring is permanence. The redoubt he lost in 1802 was, in the end, merely a trading post. The one he now intends to build, New Archangel, will be a capital, a city of the empire. This time, the Russians will not merely occupy Sitka. They will plant a flag meant to last forever. As the ships move into the bay, Katlian's warriors move up the shoreline, paddling their traditional war canoes, moving like shadows across the water. They paddle silently through hidden channels and kelp beds, their strokes timed perfectly with the splash of the waves. Each canoe carries warriors armed with flintlock muskets, clubs, and carved knives. Many wear helmets shaped like raven beaks or wolf heads. Baranov lands his forces near the ruins of the old redoubt St. Archangel Michael. He expects resistance, but not the full force of the Tlingits. His men unload cannon and dig shallow trenches, preparing to rebuild the fort atop the ashes. As the Russians are engrossed in this task, the Tlingit scouts signal from the ridges, using flashes of light bounced from copper mirrors and bird call whistles. Katlian himself now watches on from a rocky overlook, hidden from the Russians' view. He feels assured that victory is at hand. The Tlingit know their land. They know the tides and the forests, the rhythms of elk and eagles, and they know that this battle is not the beginning of a conflict, but the boiling point of a war already decades in motion. As the Russians work, the warriors now creep into position for an attack. Meanwhile, farther back in the woods, also hidden from the Russians' view, the Tlingit's own fortress rises like a wooden beast from the forest floor. Behind its wooden palisade walls, men prepare for siege, melting lead for musket balls, stuffing powder into horns, and sharpening blades. Suddenly, the rain stops, and the mist clears. A raven cries overhead. With their surroundings now more visible, the Russians see the maneuvering Tlingit warriors. In a hurried response, the Russians rapidly assemble their forces and open fire upon the Tlingit. The first volley cracks through the forest like thunder. In their response, the Tlingit marksmen open fire from concealed ridges. Some of Baranov's men stumble. Some collapse instantly, and others scramble behind felled logs. Smoke hangs low as musket flashes ignite in every direction, and the Russians now realize that they have walked straight into a trap. Suddenly, with a mighty war cry, Katlian himself charges from the brush. His hammer, a battle trophy taken from the 1802 battle, is in his hand, and his face is twisted in a fury. Dozens follow him, erupting from the forest in a wave of noise and color. The Russians now fall back in confusion. Their Aleut allies hesitate, caught between fear and obligation. This is not the organized resistance they had expected. This is a bloody, chaotic fight. Baranov orders his cannon to fire into the trees. The blasts rip through branches and bodies alike. Some Tlingit fall, but others press even closer, too near for the artillery to angle downwards. Fighting turns into chaos. Bayonets meet clubs, sabers clash, and screams echo through the fog. Baranov is wounded, struck in the face by a club. His men begin to retreat down the beach, carrying their dead and wounded comrades. The Tlingit, for their part, do not pursue far. They fall back into the woods, satisfied for now. The first day has ended in blood and confusion. As night falls, the Tlingit retreat back to their fort and hold their ground. From inside the sapling fort, they tend to their wounded and prepare for the next assault. Fires burn low behind the palisade walls, and in the distance, the sound of Russian axes and hammers returns. Baranov's men are working through the night. 2 days pass. The Russians complete the framing of their new fort, calling it New Archangel. The injured Baranov cedes command to Naval Captain Yuri Lysyansky, whose ship, the Neva, sits anchored just offshore. The Tlingit watch from their fort, waiting for the next move. On October 4th, the Russian warship opens fire upon them. For hours, its cannons roar, launching volley after volley into the forest. Trees fall, and smoke blankets the mountainside. Inside the fort, Tlingit warriors hold their positions, unable to attack or maneuver under the barrage. Cannonballs breach the outer wall, splinters fly, and warriors rush to repair the damage with fresh logs and animal hides. Despite the dire nature of their circumstances, though, still the Tlingit hold on. For the following several days, the Neva bombards the fort, but the Tlingit refuse to break. Still, among their ranks, tensions are growing. Food is running low. Water is becoming scarce. The warriors' resolve remains unbroken, but elders warn that if the siege drags on, survival may become impossible. Katlian listens. He understands now what must be done. On October 8th, as the fog thickens, the Tlingit now slip away. Silently, they move through the mist. They vanish into the land, retreating north to regroup and survive. When the Russian troops storm the fort the very next morning, they find nothing but silence. The walls still stand. The fire pits are cold. A copper helmet lies in the dirt, but the Tlingit are gone. Baranov, now recovered enough to resume command, orders the Russian flag to be raised over the ruins. Sitka is declared a possession of the Russian Empire. A Russian Orthodox priest offers a blessing, but the victory feels hollow. The price in blood has been high, and the land, aside from the small redoubt they have just carved out, still, for all intents and purposes, belongs to the Tlingit. As the Russian flag flies on the coast, Katlian stands before a fire at the Tlingit's camp miles away, mourning his dead and preparing his people for the long winter ahead. For both the Russians and the Tlingit alike, the future is now very uncertain. The very next morning, Baranov's men resume work on their fort. Trees are felled, earth is moved, timber barracks soon rise beside a stockade of sharpened logs. Cannons are mounted facing the harbor. Warehouses are erected to store fur pelts, flour, and black powder. Baranov declares the region pacified and sends word back to St. Petersburg that Sitka has been retaken and secured. Russian settlers soon follow. Company agents, shipwrights, traders, and clerks. More Orthodox churches are built, and a governor's house is established on a nearby rise overlooking the bay. Aleut laborers, many brought involuntarily, are put to work harvesting furs and assisting with construction. At an initial glance, it seems Baranov has accomplished his goal. But beneath the surface, there is unease. The forest never feels entirely silent. At night, fires flicker in the far hills. Canoes are often spotted on distant shores. The Tlingit are seemingly gone, but obviously not defeated. And every man within the walls of New Archangel knows this land is not truly theirs. It is borrowed, held in tension, and bought in blood. The Battle of Sitka would be the last major armed conflict between Russian forces and the Tlingit, though smaller attacks and firefights would continue for years. For his part, Alexander Baranov will go on to be awarded the Order of St. Anna, second class, from the Russian government in 1807, in recognition of his services to his country. He would establish Fort Ross in California in 1812 and pursue a failed trading venture in Hawaii in 1815. He would eventually pass away in March of 1819 in the Dutch East Indies after becoming ill during a return trip to St. Petersburg. The ultimate fate of Katlian, the mighty Tlingit chief, is unknown, but his legacy lives on strong amongst his people even to this day. He stands as a symbol of Tlingit strength, resilience, and courage. But the innumerable stories of his people's bravery, as well as the stories of conquest and warfare in the history of Russia and Alaska, are, for tonight, other stories for other times. Seattle, Washington, January 26, 1856. As a cold morning wind rolls in from the Pacific, a group of Nisqually warriors lie quiet in the shadowy woods surrounding the cabin of local settler Tom Pepper. They are waiting for the perfect moment to unleash their ambush on first this cabin and then the whole of the burgeoning settlement of Seattle. Several groups of their fellow warriors now lie in wait at various points around the town, waiting for their moment to strike. But just as the first rays of sunlight appear through the trees, a thunderous boom is heard coming from the bay. Then, seconds later, a few hundred yards away, the hillside seemingly explodes out of nowhere, sending chunks of soil and timber in all directions and shaking the very ground beneath them. It is an artillery shell, fired from the deck of the USS Decatur, a naval vessel harbored in the cold waters of Puget Sound. Now, chaos breaks out amongst the warriors. Their plan of attack has been compromised, but the battle has just begun, and now there is no turning back. However, with time now being of the essence, the attack on Pepper's cabin is abandoned. The main target of their attack now turns to one of the fortified American blockhouses that surround the city. The blockhouses contain a number of local militia, as well as U.S. Navy sailors and U.S. Marines charged with protecting the small settlement. Several of these defensive positions have been set in place by the captain of the Decatur, Gert Gansevoort. The navigator of the Decatur, T.S. Phelps, has spent the weeks prior to this attempting to better organize the local militia, but has been met with a staunch lack of motivation and discipline on their behalf. The sailors and Marines under his charge had acquitted themselves well in their duties, but many of the local militia had frustrated him with their lack of basic skills and their shared sentiment that Seattle was in no real danger of attack. In fact, many citizens of Seattle thought that an all-out attack from the native tribes surrounding the area was all but impossible. Now, with the attack underway, the settlement rapidly devolves into chaos. The men within the blockhouses are roused and ordered to their positions. Some of the men, primarily the Marines and sailors, begin to fire their weapons into the oncoming native warriors. But many of the militia prove to be combat ineffective, at least initially, as they intermittently abandon their positions or simply hide behind the wooden breastworks, too unnerved by the attack to mount any kind of defense. The native forces, composed of warriors from several tribes including the Nisqually, the Klickitat, the Spokane, the Palouse, the Walla Walla, the Yakima, and the Puyallup tribe, have coalesced to resist the continued encroachment of their lands. The tensions between the Americans and the native tribes had risen to a fever pitch the year prior to this, in 1855. After the United States formally recognized the Washington Territories in 1853, treaties had been struck between the U.S. government and many of the tribes surrounding the area. However, as was often the case, these agreements were often broached by the United States as expansion and settlement of the areas beyond the agreed-upon bounds continued. The Nisqually tribe, who had inhabited the inland forest and mountains for thousands of years, had initially had peaceful interactions with the government and settlers. But the 1854 Treaty of Medicine Creek had caused a sizable rift between themselves and the U.S. government when the tribe agreed to cede some of their lands, but ended up losing their prime farming territory. Among the most vocal critics of the treaty was a Nisqually chief named Leshy, who argued that the treaty was unscrupulous and unfair. He had rallied several of his fellow tribesmen to march to Olympia, demanding to see the governor, a man by the name of Colonel Isaac Stevens. But Stevens, in staunch opposition to his cause, refused to even meet with him. Seeing the treatment of their chief at the hands of the governor, many of the Nisqually had seen no other recourse but military action. Chief Leshy himself had opposed attacking the city of Seattle, but his words had fallen on deaf ears. In the weeks prior to this attack, a band of Nisqually warriors had wrought havoc on a series of settlements on nearby White Creek. Several Americans had been killed, and tensions had continued to rise. However, Governor Stevens had still dismissed any notion that there might be a large-scale attack on Seattle itself. The governor had then departed the settlement, secure in his assessment that any further violence would be limited and inconsequential. However, almost immediately following his departure, several of Seattle's native inhabitants, many of whom had developed close relationships with many of the settlers, had fervently warned their American friends that an attack was all but imminent. One Seattle resident, a local doctor named David Swinson Maynard, went so far as to evacuate 434 native residents to the west side of the bay so as to protect them from a large-scale attack on the east side of the bay. But still, many other Seattle residents agreed with Governor Stevens' assessment of the situation and continued to deny any possibility of danger. Many of the volunteer local militia had even argued in the preceding weeks that an organized defense force was needless, as the naval ship Decatur was now anchored in the bay and would provide more than enough defense against any attacking force. Now, as the native warriors flood past the defensive positions of the Marines and the militiamen, it seems to many of the residents that their hubris might now cost them their lives. As gunshots ring out up and down First Street, 52 women and children are evacuated to the Decatur, taking refuge aboard the ship while the fight unfolds. Most of the remaining native inhabitants also take to their canoes, taking to the water and visibly separating themselves from the attacking native forces in order to avoid any confusion and friendly fire. Meanwhile, the 3rd Division of Marines now decide that they must mount a head-on charge in order to drive back the oncoming warriors now pouring down the main trail into town. Seeing the dire nature of their situation, this division disobeys their orders to hold their position and charges upon one faction of the attacking warriors. The charge itself is a disorganized, haphazard affair, as the Marines charge up a steep hill to cut off the native warriors. However chaotic, though, the tactic does in fact work, repelling the oncoming warriors to the northeast and buying the other defenders precious time in order to fortify their positions inside the city limits. Tragically, though, as the Americans had begun their charge from the outskirts of Seattle, an errant shot from one of the native warriors resulted in a young boy named Milton G. Holgate being struck and killed. Meanwhile, south of town, A prolonged but intermittent gunfight takes place between a group of Seattle citizens and a group of native warriors, the parties being separated by a large expanse of boggy territory. The fight here continues for several hours, seeing several native warriors either killed or wounded, but only one Seattle resident, a man by the name of Christian White, a relative newcomer to town, being killed when he stuck his head out from behind the log he was using as cover in order to get a drink from the nearby stream. Now, both warriors and Seattle residents settle into stalemates at every position surrounding the town, with the fight grinding on through the afternoon. Though the warriors fight valiantly, their morale soon begins to wane. Not only have they taken on more casualties than they had anticipated, but the incessant cannon fire being poured into their positions from the Decatur is making an all-out takeover of the town seem less and less probable. This adds to the demoralization of the warrior coalition, as many young men among them anticipated a great victory against the settlers, one that would drive their enemy from their territory for good. But many things have already gone wrong. First, the timing of the attack itself seems to have been a costly mistake. The initial plan had been to attack during the nighttime. Had they done this, they would likely have caught the men in the blockhouses completely off guard before the Decatur had a chance to pour in its cannon deflates. The time for this attack had, in fact, been carefully planned, and the warriors had reconnoitered the habits and routines of the military forces surrounding Seattle. They had discerned that the enlistments of the militia volunteers often expired on the 21st of the month, and thus an attack later in the month would mean striking the town when it was at its weakest. They had also watched closely as the Decatur had limped into the Puget Sound the week prior, having been badly damaged on a reef as she had made her way south along the Pacific coastline. The ship had been so badly damaged that it had to be beached for repairs. Seeing the compromised state of Seattle's defenses, many among the warriors had felt that a resounding victory had been all but assured. Now, as they hunker down behind the trees and stumps and fallen logs to avoid the gunfire coming from the settlers and the incessant fire from the Decatur, their hopes seem dashed. By early evening, as the sun begins to sink into the western horizon, the native forces begin to withdraw. Though the exact numbers of their losses are unknown, it is estimated that roughly 28 are killed. Comparatively, the Americans have suffered a total of 3 fatalities: the young Milton Holgate, the unfortunate Christian White, and another Navy sailor, a deserter from the Decatur who was mistakenly shot by a frightened settler as he attempted to barge into the settler's cabin in search of shelter from the battle. Despite the cessation of the battle, though, as the moon rises over Seattle, its residents remain in a state of vigilance and unease. They do not know whether the warriors have retreated for good or if they are merely regrouping somewhere in the dark woods. But the next day sees no attack, and it seems that the Battle of Seattle is over. But now, a fresh wave of paranoia sweeps the residents, as does a growing resentment for Governor Stevens for leaving them so vulnerable to the attack. At around noon the next day, another naval vessel, the USS Active, sails into the Puget Sound, carrying Governor Stevens. He appears before the residents, seemingly contrite and chagrined, and promises that he will order their city to be immediately fortified against another such attack. With his political and personal failure weighing heavily on both himself and his reputation, Stevens reboards the USS Active and heads back to the capital of Olympia in order to raise the alarm and make good on his promises. Several days after the attack, Nisqually Chief Leshy and a number of his fellow warriors appear at the ranch of local settler John McLeod and his Nisqually wife. They insist that they were not involved in the attack on Seattle. They plead for the pair to argue their case to the governor,
insisting that they were in fact not part of the attack on the city and thus should not be punished by any retributions meted out by the government. But in 1857, Leshy would be arrested for the supposed murder of a local militiaman during the Puget Sound War. Though he had indeed been involved in the fighting during the war, the consensus amongst both his fellow Nisqually and even the Americans themselves, soldiers and settlers alike, is that Leshy is indeed innocent of these charges. In fact, his first trial had resulted in a hung jury. Then, a retrial was ordered, and Governor Stevens, hungry to make an example of Leshy in hopes of dissuading any further attacks, had heavily pressured legal officials for a conviction. The second trial would indeed result in a guilty verdict, and Leshy was sentenced to be executed by hanging at Fort Steilacoom. This sentence was seen as such a judicial travesty that the local sheriff, Tom Granger, submitted to arrest rather than carry out the hanging. Officers at the fort also protested, arguing that the only killing Leshy had done had been in battle, which was not a crime necessitating capital punishment. They viewed him as a fellow warrior, and though an enemy combatant, still worthy of respect. Many protests from the Nisqually and other native tribes, as well as settlers throughout the area, poured into Governor Stevens' office, but fell on deaf ears. Thus, on February 19, 1858, Chief Leshy, a baptized Catholic since his youth, walked to the gallows at the fort, accompanied by the fort's Catholic priest, Father Pascal Ricard. Eyewitness accounts describe Leshy as dignified and courageous in his last moments, but all remark on the great travesty of justice he suffered before meeting his death at the end of the hangman's noose. This incident was seen as judicial murder, plain and simple, and forever damaged relations between the Americans and the native tribes. It also did irreparable damage to the reputation of Governor Stevens. In the coming years, the Puget Sound War would come to an end, and Seattle would continue to expand. And the Nisqually and their neighbors would see their territories continue to contract in the face of encroaching settlement. The Nisqually would find themselves confined to the Medicine Creek Reservation, where they would continue to see their lands shrink until many of them were displaced again by the United States in 1917 during World War I. Stevens himself would be called back into duty with the Army at the outbreak of the Civil War. Appointed as colonel of the 79th New York Volunteers, he would later be promoted to brigadier general. On September 1, 1862, he would be killed in the Battle of Chantilly, after attempting to carry the regimental colors when his color-bearer was wounded in the initial charge against the Confederate forces. He would be laid to rest in Rhode Island in 1862, only 4 years after Chief Leshy's execution. Though the Battle of Seattle resulted in relatively few deaths and casualties, the ripple effect of the attack resounded through the Pacific Northwest for decades. In the decades that followed, Seattle would grow from a small settlement to a sizable port city, and eventually to its current iteration as a modern metropolitan hub for technology, medicine, education, and industry. Most of Seattle's current 800,000-plus residents, along with over 4 million residents in the greater Seattle area, have likely never heard of the 1856 life-and-death fight between native warriors and early Seattle residents. But this battle played a pivotal role in not only the history of their city, but in the history of the native tribes of their area and the United States as well. But the many stories of the Puget Sound War, as well as the proud native peoples of the Pacific Northwest and the intrepid settlers of the American West, are, for tonight, other stories for other times.
Klamath Lake, Oregon, May 9th, 1846. In the middle of the night, a group of mountain men lie in much-deserved sleep after a hard day's travel of roughly 60 miles through the rugged terrain of southern Oregon. Their party, 14 strong, is composed of experienced mountain men from a variety of background. Included among them are 3 native Delaware tribesmen, as well as the French-descendant, St. Louis-born Basil Lajeunesse. They are led by John C. Fremont, a former U.S. Army cartographer who has, by means of both merit and a powerful father-in-law, managed to secure himself a congressional appointment to explore the American West. For the better part of the 1840s, he has conducted exploratory missions throughout the West. However, much of the territory he is exploring does not belong to the United States. It, in fact, belongs to Mexico. Though fur trappers, traders, sailors, and whalers have been finding their way to California by sea or by overland crossing for decades now, the territory of Northern California is still, at this point in 1846, relatively unknown and uninhabited. It is owned, ostensibly, by Mexico, as it had been owned by the Spanish before. But in reality, neither government has invested much in the way of resources towards settling the wild lands that lay to the north and to the east of the mission systems that hug the coastline. By and large, this area of Northern California and Oregon is, in fact, under the control of the tribes who have long ruled their respective areas of domain from the San Joaquin Valley to the Cascade Mountains. This meant that the ruling government's headquarters, thousands of miles away in Mexico City, was of little to no use to the Mexican citizens inhabiting the area. However, the land was bountiful, and, at a time when the population was scarcely more than a few thousand people in Northern California, plentiful and ready for the taking by any settler with means and intentions to do so. As was the case in Texas a decade earlier, this openness and availability has drawn a fair amount of American farmers, ranchers, and entrepreneurs. The lack of regulation from the Mexican government provides an enticing prospect for those who have, as of yet, been unable to secure a plot of land and sustain a livelihood elsewhere. The vast, open swaths of ungoverned and unsettled territory also draws the interest of the United States government. Since the expedition of Lewis and Clark 4 decades earlier, the national adherence to the doctrine of manifest destiny has become increasingly vociferous. As the desire for a continent-spanning nation has become more and more apparent amongst the voting public, and the outcry for greater settlement begins to trickle in from Americans living in Northern California, President John Tyler, and then his successor James K. Polk, begin to take increasing interest in wresting the territory from Mexico. But first, the United States must have a better understanding of the territory they hope to overtake and annex. Thus, the services of John C. Fremont have been enlisted on a number of exploratory jaunts that have seen the inveterate, well-connected explorer cover vast swaths of the Rockies and Sierra Nevadas, not to mention numerous trips through deserts and to the Pacific coastline. Fremont now finds himself here, on the shoreline of the vast Klamath Lake, on yet another excursion being undertaken under the decidedly odd pretense of exploring a country that is not his to explore. Now, it seems another layer is being added to this mission by James K. Polk himself. In the week prior, Fremont's company had been surprised on the trail by a hurried, breathless U.S. Marine lieutenant named Archibald Gillespie. Lieutenant Gillespie had appeared seemingly out of nowhere, materializing from amidst the hulking redwoods like a travel-weary specter. Though his presence seems a curious novelty to most of these men, he brings news of great import for Fremont. Gillespie has been dispatched by President James K. Polk himself, with messages for the American consuls in Los Angeles as well as for John Fremont. After making his way from Washington, D.C. to Mexico and then taking a ship to Los Angeles, Gillespie was informed that Fremont's expedition was on its way north, hundreds of miles ahead of him. Gillespie had made an incredible effort through environments that his training as a Marine in the 1830s had not prepared him for, in order to catch up to Fremont and Company and deliver the secret messages. What the messages say will be lost to history, but it is thought to concern Fremont's involvement in the coming efforts to annex California for the United States. The men in Fremont's company are unsure of the exact nature of the correspondence, but are sure that they now find their leader in a fitfully distracted state. He had conferred with Gillespie late into the night as he pored over the letters. He had been so assured of their safety and so ensconced in his new business at hand with Gillespie that Fremont had given all the men license to sleep freely, without posting a guard. While many in the party had seen this as a welcome relief, one man does not. His name is Christopher Houston Carson, otherwise known as Kit Carson. At 37 years old, he is not only a legendary mountain man, but has become an inadvertent pop culture figure. All across the eastern seaboard and the big cities of New York, Boston, Philadelphia, and Washington, D.C., men, women, and children alike delighted in reading the dime novels replete with highly fictionalized accounts of his daring and expertise. Though Carson is the first to dispel any notion of his own celebrity, his renown is certainly not without cause. He has seen more of the continent than almost any man living at this time. He has traded, fought, and even married into local tribes on the Great Plains and in the vast Southwest. He has survived all manner of privation, hardship, and danger for over 2 decades in locales from the Rocky Mountains to the city of Los Angeles to the sun-drenched prairies of Kansas. He has spent over a decade as a mountain man in the company of legendary trappers such as Bill Williams, Jim Bridger, and Ewing Young. He had married an Arapaho woman named Singing Grass, and the couple had had 2 children. However, in 1839, Singing Grass had died of complications during labor, leaving Carson to care for 2 young daughters. He had remarried to a Cheyenne woman named Making Out Road, but the marriage had ended quickly in divorce, and his children had not been welcome. In April of 1842, after his youngest daughter, whose name is unknown, was killed in a tragic accident after falling into a vat of boiling soap, Carson had decided to bring his surviving daughter to Missouri to stay with relatives. While on a steamboat on the Missouri River, he was recognized by John C. Fremont, who engaged the vaunted frontiersman in conversation and convinced him to sign on as a guide for his new scientific expedition. Carson soon found himself again headed west, providing navigation and direction for Fremont's party. Over the course of the next few years, the 2 men and their small company would traverse vast expanses of the American West. By 1846, they have already made 2 expeditions and accumulated thousands of miles. By all accounts, Carson has been, time and again, the party's saving grace from certain disaster. However, Carson, despite his notoriety and confidence in his own skills, is a man keenly aware of his own limitations. He is a man from a poor family, and for all intents and purposes, illiterate. His natural inclination, despite his authority and experience and aptitude, is to defer the burden of leadership to the wealthy, well-connected, and well-educated Fremont. So, earlier in this evening, as the men had eaten dinner and prepared their beds, Carson had dutifully obliged to Fremont's decision not to post a guard for the evening. But as much as Carson's mind had prevented him from verbalizing his concerns to his boss, his nerves, acclimated to constant sensitivity from a life spent on the trail, will not let him sleep soundly. Carson feels assured that the party is indeed vulnerable to attack. In the weeks prior to their arrival at Klamath Lake, Fremont, Carson, and company had been involved in a number of skirmishes with natives throughout the Northern California area. The most notable of these being the Wintu Massacre, also known as the Sacramento River Massacre. In late March of 1846, the Fremont party had arrived at the Lassen Ranch in the northern Sacramento Valley, only to be informed by settlers that they believed a native attack upon them was imminent. Taking them at their word, and eager to seize an opportunity to both pad his military record as well as to instill some measure of intimidation into the surrounding natives, Fremont headed out in search of the native forces said to be amassing nearby. Under his charge were 60 Americans, including the trappers in his party, as well as, quote, 9 Delaware Indians, 2 California Indians, and 5 members of a nearby trading post. On April 5th, they had come upon a large camp of the Wintu people. Though this was indeed a large settlement, there was no indication that the people within were in the process of marshaling any sort of assault upon the settlers in the area. However, Fremont saw their sheer number and presence in the area as sufficient cause to order an attack. The village was set upon from 3 sides by the forces under Fremont's command. Thomas Breckinridge, a member of Fremont's exploratory party and present at the incident, gave the following account. The order was given to ask no quarter and to give none. The settlers charged into the village, taking the warriors by surprise, and then commenced a scene of slaughter which is unequaled in the West. The bucks,
Squaws and papooses were shot down like sheep, and those men never stopped as long as they could find one alive. Estimates of the number of Wentu people killed in the attack range from 150 to 700, with many drowning or being shot as they fled into the river. Word had spread quickly among all tribes of Northern California and Oregon of the great massacre inflicted upon the native people, perpetrated by the dark-haired, long-bearded officer and his party of mountain men. Though seemingly untroubled by the butchery, as he had so often been privy to in his life on the frontier, Carson is all too keenly aware of the potential consequences such actions might incur. Sometime after midnight, his wire-tight nerves snap Carson out of his shallow slumber. Amidst the lapping of waves on the lake shore, the crackling of coals in the campfire, and the occasional rustle of wind through the trees, an odd, dull thumping noise causes his eyes to snap open, and immediately surveil the campsite. With only the light of the campfire to illuminate the scene, Carson can at first find nothing amiss. Then his eyes settle on the oddly contorted position in which his good friend Basil La Jeunesse is sleeping. "What's the matter over there, Basil?" Carson inquires. Then he notices an odd glistening of the firelight off La Jeunesse's head and torso. Within seconds, the situation is clear to the experienced mountain man. His friend has been killed, bludgeoned by a native warrior's club, and the camp is under attack. Carson, the first in the camp to awake to this horror, calls out, "Indians!" and fires his pistol into the darkness. As Carson's cry is still echoing off the trees surrounding them, the other men are awakened. Lucian Maxwell, Alex Godey, and Dick Owens, all longtime friends and compatriots of Carson's, now have their pistols and tomahawks drawn, eyes searching the night, seeking any kind of available cover. Arrows whistle by them, thudding into the tree trunks as dark figures whirl about just outside the light of the fire. A Delaware tracker known as Crane grabs a rifle and attempts to fire into the darkness, but it is either unloaded or misfires. As a few attacking warriors dash through the camp, Crane attempts to club them with his now otherwise useless firearm. In his fury, he becomes unaware of his position in front of the fire, making him a well-illuminated target for his attackers. Moments after being exposed by the light of the fire, Crane's torso is filled with arrows, and he falls dead. As Carson's eyes sweep the campsite, he hears a loud, guttural moan from his right. Looking over his shoulder, he sees the motionless body of Denny, his good friend and a much-beloved Delaware tracker. Turning his attention again towards the center of the camp, hoping to catch some of the attacking warriors in the same firelight that had doomed the Delaware Crane, Carson sees a lone warrior, resplendent in full war paint and headdress, standing his ground in the middle of the camp, fighting with unabashed fury. With a fine steel tomahawk, he cuts and slashes at the camp defenders, exhorting the other attackers with his war cries. Carson presumes this to be the chief, as do the other experienced mountain men in the party. The next volley of shots from their rifles and pistols renders the attacking chief no more, as he too falls next to the flickering campfire. For the bulk of the next hour, the attacking warriors make repeated, though seemingly haphazard, attacks upon the campsite, hoping to reclaim the body of their fallen leader. Eventually, the attacks abate, and the survivors spend the next few hours in a pensive state, waiting for another assault to materialize from the darkness. Finally, the sun begins to peek over the craggy mountains surrounding the lake. Some of the men set about laying blankets over the bodies of Denny, Crane, and La Jeunesse as Carson and Fremont examine the fallen chief. He is, Carson is sure, a Klamath, a people he has derided before as a mean, low-life, and treacherous race. The chief, now cold in death, his ornate war bonnet crumpled by his last fall, is covered in jagged designs of bright war paint. Carson would later recall him to be the bravest Indian I ever saw. But in this moment, as his comrades lie strewn in death on the ground around him, Carson is overcome with an unconquerable mix of grief and rage. As his eyes blur and his nostrils flare, he deliberately takes the tomahawk, secured to the chief's wrist with a leather thong, from its owner. For a few moments, Carson examines the weapon with the curiosity and awe of a seasoned cultural anthropologist. The weapon is heavy-headed but well-balanced, the handle sitting nicely in the palm, and its blade razor-sharp. Then, in a sudden torrent of rage that shocks Fremont and the newcomer Gillespie, Carson raises the weapon up and powerfully, repeatedly smashes it into the face and head of the fallen chief. Again and again, the blows rain down, until the chief's head is, by Carson's later estimation, all knocked to pieces. When his grief is momentarily satiated, Carson confers with Fremont as to the next course of action. Revenge, both agree, must be the order of the day. First, though, there is the business of burying their comrades. The 3 dead men are wrapped in blankets and strapped sideways onto their horses. Fremont and Carson initially planned to bury their friends at a scenic spot on the lake shore. However, as they travel in search of a suitable location, the bodies of the dead men are repeatedly bludgeoned and knocked off of their mounts by the numerous trees that obfuscate any clear path through the territory. Soon, the bodies are bruised, and the task becomes so distasteful that the company of men decide that their unfortunate cohorts must be buried on the spot in the cold, rocky soil of the forest. As a few of the men stand guard, the remainder claw at the ground with their knives, eventually digging out a singular, shallow grave big enough for 3. The men are buried with little ceremony but the prayers of their comrades, and covered with logs and rocks in order to ward off predators. With their comrades now buried, the men's grief and rage runs unfettered. Their first order of business now is to find any Klamath that they can and exact retribution upon them. Their Delaware scouts, after completing their own burial rituals for their fallen comrades, are the first to head out into the silent labyrinth of trees in search of any lingering Klamath. They are gone only a short time when they reappear, this time each holding a freshly taken scalp. "Was sick, better now," one said. The Delaware, Carson, and a small group then head up the Klamath Lake shoreline, scouting for a larger village. About 10 miles ahead of Fremont and the remainder of the men, Carson and the company stumble upon a large village of Klamath. They, too, are quickly spotted by the Klamath, whose women and children scatter in all directions as the men in the village race to arm themselves, and those who had been out fishing hurriedly beach their canoes in a rush to reach their weapons and fellow defenders. With the element of surprise lost, Carson and his men must now make an immediate attack, which they do, with another massacre ensuing. Though accounts vary, with Carson insisting that no women or children were killed, at least one old woman was found among the dead. The huts of the villages are set ablaze, which Carson deems a beautiful sight to behold. As smoke and flames engulf the village, Fremont, disappointed to have missed out on the action, gallops into the camp with the rest of his men. Though he has been unable to catch up to Carson in time for the attack, it will be only a matter of hours until Fremont can claim a coup of his own. As Carson is surveying the destruction wrought by his small attacking band on this, the largest Klamath village in the area, a lone warrior returns and, seeing what has occurred in his absence, draws an arrow aimed directly at Carson. The sudden motion catches Carson's eye, and he draws his pistol and squeezes the trigger, but the weapon misfires. Fremont, a few yards away, spots the Klamath taking aim and spurs his powerful gray warhorse, Sacramento, at the man, trampling him under hoof. The lone Klamath is then pounced upon by a Delaware named Segunde and bludgeoned to death with a war club. Though Carson's allegiance to Fremont has thus far been unwavering, this incident will forever instill an unflagging obedience to the Army officer that will carry on for the rest of Carson's life. Now, as the Klamath village lies in destruction, with Klamath warriors strewed about the ground in their final repose, Carson again confers with Fremont as to their next move. He is informed that they must now, with the advent of the information brought in the top-secret letters by the Marine Archibald Gillespie, return to California. There is a rebellion on against the Mexican government, and Fremont, Carson, and company will all play a pivotal role. The party heads south, leaving the Klamath village to burn and the survivors to mourn. The village is never rebuilt, and the survivors scatter to other bands. Though they have been held accountable by Fremont and Carson for the deaths of their friends, many experts today believe that the Klamath had, in fact, been innocent of any involvement in the attack on the Americans' camp. Instead, it is now believed that the offending tribe had been the Modoc, a culturally related but longtime enemy of the Klamath people. It does not seem that Carson was terribly concerned with the deeds of himself and his men that day as, in his later account, he would deem it a perfect butchery. Carson, though, already a famous figure, will go on to cement his legend in the coming decades, as will Fremont. Few figures in American history have been as consequential as these two men, and their deeds will, for better or worse, carry great weight for years well after their deaths. The stories of exploration, navigation, adventure, survival, combat, and killing seem almost too numerous to tell, and though rest assured, history at the OK Corral will do our best to tell them all, for tonight, they are other stories for other times.
July 14th, 1828, southwestern Oregon. As the initial rays of sunlight struggled their way through the dense forest canopy in vaporous morning fog, finally reflecting on the rippling waters of the Umpqua River, a group of 4 men prepare to cast off in their dugout canoe. Their intention is to find a more passable route of travel rather than the circuitous, marshy path they had found themselves on in the last few days. 3 of the men are part of a 15 to 20 person band of fur trappers making their way north to Fort Vancouver in hopes of trading some of the fruits of their labors for some much-needed supplies, horses, and a respite from the omnipresent threats presented by the wilds of the Pacific Northwest. For them, the conditions presented by their current environs are at once shakingly unfamiliar and tranquilizingly routine. They had been making their way across the American West for the better part of 2 years, from St. Louis, across the Salt Lake Desert, the Mojave Desert, over the Sierra Nevadas, and up from Southern California to Northern California, and then on to Oregon. They had seen all manner of hardships along the way, from grizzly attacks to hostile Mexican government officials to attacks from hostile native tribes. Less than a year earlier, some of these men had been among the few survivors to emerge from an attack by the Mojave tribe in the austere, Joshua tree-strewn desert that bears their name. They hailed from all manners of backgrounds and ethnicities, though most were American Protestants from states like Pennsylvania, Virginia, Ohio, and New York. Though their diversity in culture and experience makes their collective categorization all but impossible, it is safe to say that none among them had seen wilderness like what they had encountered in the previous few weeks. They had made their way up from the San Joaquin Valley in central California, northwest through giant redwoods to the northern California coast. They had hung close to the coastline, staying as close to the water as possible during the low tide and moving back up toward the timber as the water level necessitated. As they made their way north, they found the terrain and the native tribes less and less hospitable. The 4th man in their crew, though, felt right at home as they paddled up the frigid river lined with Oregon white oaks. He was a member of the Umpqua tribe, an umbrella group of several smaller subgroups, all of which had resided here in the Umpqua Valley for generations. Specifically, he was a member of the Lower Umpqua Band. The etymology of the word Umpqua is thought to trace back to a word from their neighbors to the south, the Tolowa tribe. It is theorized to mean a place along the river, or thundering water, or dancing water, or bring across the river. They spoke the Siuslaw language, lived in cedar plank houses, and survived by both hunting and fishing in forests, streams, and ocean inlets in their home territory. They were also, like most tribes in North America at this point, increasingly impacted and influenced by the encroachment of Europeans and North Americans in their homelands. Like most tribes along the northern California and southern Oregon coastal ranges, the Umpqua were not averse to violent retaliation in response to trespassing in their territory. But they were not averse to making their lives easier either. However masterful the Umpqua, and for that matter any native tribe, may have been as woodsmen, life for them was still incredibly difficult. Not only was hunting made easier with firearms, but cleaning and dressing the animal were often easier with steel knives than with stone tools. Falling trees and splitting firewood was a far less laborious task when using a steel axe obtained from the whites. Though beads made from seashells and bones were indeed beautiful, the glass beads from the European and American traders could be garnered in a wider array of colors and a far greater quantity. Medicines, foodstuffs, blankets, fabrics, and gunsmithing services
were all highly valued goods and services that most tribes could procure through few, if any, other sources than via trading with the whites. This led to an unavoidable mixing of cultures and a variety of cultural, economic, and military alliances. Though clashes were frequent throughout the West, as had been the case for the trapping party in the preceding weeks, the prevailing rule was that the enemy of one's enemy was one's friend. Many in the modern world often create a fundamental false binary of simply whites versus natives, when this does a fundamental disservice to both groups. The native tribes from Alaska to Argentina lived in harsh, conflict-ridden worlds in which life was a constant struggle for resources and safety. Just as in the modern world, pragmatism often won out over cultural purity in the interest of survival. Though this party of mountain men were clearly and presently trespassers in Umpqua territory, they could perhaps serve more utility as allies than enemies, or so the Umpqua had initially thought. And, for their part, nothing would have made the mountain men happier. Though many among them were certainly partial to the ardent nationalism of the early 19th century, almost all were cultural and economic pragmatists first and foremost. Their goal was not to acquire territory, nor to entice the native tribes into a fight. Quite the contrary, their endeavors were essentially purely economic in nature, and thus many mountain men prided themselves on their ability to navigate the turbulent waters between such wildly different cultures. This was especially true for the leader of this party, the young but already legendary Jedediah Smith. Though he was only 29 years old, he had already spent a decade of his life in the wilds of the American West. He had been born in 1799 in what is today Bainbridge, New York, to Jedediah Smith Sr. and Sally Strong, longtime New Englanders of staunch, puritanical stock. The family moved to Erie County, Pennsylvania when Smith was still a boy, and by age 13, his innate thirst for adventure led him to find a job as a clerk on a Lake Erie freighter. Here, he came across a number of frontiersmen and fur trappers, many under the employ of the Hudson Bay Company. Thoroughly regaled with tales of daring, adventure, and riches had from capitalizing on Europe's obsessive demand for New World furs, Smith set out for St. Louis at the age of 17, and by 1822, census information shows him living in the burgeoning, though doubtless still austere, frontier city. Here, his hopes of obtaining employment with a fur company expedition were realized when he, along with 99 other adventure-hungry young men, answered a newspaper ad in the Missouri Gazette. The ad was posted by General William H. Ashley, another eventually legendary figure in the history of the mountain men and fur trade in the American West. General Ashley called for 100 enterprising young men to head northwest to the Rockies in search of beaver pelts that were used to make the hats now so in vogue in London taverns and Paris cafes. In the spring of 1823, the company, known to history as Ashley's 100, left St. Louis, and Jedediah left his old life behind forever. He had risen quickly through the loose commandatory hierarchy of the fur trapping companies, comporting himself with courage and composition time and again under the duress of frustration, starvation, thirst, and combat. He had seen countless close friends die in violent ways, endured seemingly endless travel and privation, and seen his boyish good looks scarred forever after narrowly surviving an attack from a grizzly bear. Through it all, Smith had been noted for his moderation, his piety, his reliability, and his skill as a woodsman, marksman, and trapper. Now, though, as he found himself seated in a canoe next to his Umpqua guide and trapper compatriots, Jed Smith was tired. He had come thousands of miles, seen so much, and yet still had not managed to acquire the financial success he had hoped to nearly a decade ago. As the iridescently haunting rays of sunlight began to poke more and more holes in the forest canopy, one can imagine the deep sense of fatigue that must have set in as Smith surmised his current situation in its totality. He and his men were all travel-weary, within striking distance of starvation, and summarily weakened in both body and mind. The preceding days had been worryingly turbulent, and they must have weighed heavily on his mind. He and his men had encountered the Umpqua a few days earlier in a trade meeting that encapsulated the terse, uncertain, and all too human nature of Native and Euro-American interactions spanning from the 1400s to the 21st century. Having spotted some Umpqua sentries at a distance, Smith and his party made signs to parley and initiate trade in hopes of both restoring their supplies and building an amicable relationship. Unlike their Spanish predecessors and American successors, this party of trappers hoped not to conquer or colonize, but merely to peacefully pass through on their way to Fort Vancouver. Even the most ardent extoller of the virtues of manifest destiny among them would concede that now, with a party of not quite 24 objectively overworked and severely undernourished trappers, was not the time nor the place to attempt a conquest of any kind. The Umpqua, who at this point in history rarely saw any white men, were simultaneously wary, curious, and confused. And given even a cursory glance at the territorial geopolitics all along the western coast at the time, but specifically in California and Oregon, it is quite understandable why. Though California had long been ostensibly under the control of the Spanish, the English and the Russians had, at this point, spent decades making forays into the ocean inlets and mountainscapes of the Pacific Northwest in hopes of laying claim to its innumerable resources in both flora and fauna. Private interests such as the Hudson Bay Company had also spent small fortunes on incursions deep into the unknowns of the region in hopes of establishing networks of native tribes and collecting intelligence on any potential natural boundaries to be had. In the Treaty of 1818, the United States and Britain, awash in the geocentric hubris of the time, agreed to share exploratory custody of a territory that was not theirs to begin with. Regardless, in the intervening decades, the Umpqua and their neighbors had seen a marked increase in the frequency and size of the expeditionary parties making their incursions into the territory. They had been intermittently accepting of and hostile to such incursions, but in recent months had warmed to the idea of building amicable relations with white traders in hopes of fortifying their own wealth. Jedediah Smith and his party had hoped to capitalize on this, though their interactions with the Umpqua's neighbors to the south had been terse at best and violent at worst up until now. However, seeing the only prudent course of action as taking the most amicable route, Smith intended to make some good trades and build at least some usable amount of rapport with their reluctant, suspicious hosts. The two parties had convened at the mountain men's camp on the west side of the bend in the river. At first, the mood was suspicious. However, after some initial offers and counteroffers, both sides began to relax, and a sense of reserved joviality seemed to prevail. Then, one of the men informed Jedediah Smith that an axe and a skinning knife had gone missing from the party's supplies. It was apparent that, if one of the trappers had not taken the missing items, one of the Umpqua had. Though known for his magnanimity and charity in such situations, Smith had learned through the incessant native thievery that had plagued his party since the Dakotas that no amount of charity would render the goods returned. And so he saw fit to employ more forceful measures. The suspected Umpqua was detained by Smith and two others, tied up and interrogated as to the whereabouts of the axe and knife. For hours, the suspected Umpqua denied any and all knowledge of the missing items. Interestingly though, even during this time, trading continued amongst a number of smaller parties in which the hungry trappers bartered for shellfish and berries the Umpqua had brought to trade. Finally though, the axe was found amongst the detained Umpqua's effects, though the knife never was, and he was free. Though he was indeed guilty of the theft, this particular Umpqua was a chief amongst his people, and now felt much aggrieved at his treatment by these American interlopers. He retreated across the river and complained to his fellow chiefs, demanding some kind of retributory action be taken in defense of his honor. The most senior chief in the group dissuaded him from this pursuit though, arguing that he had not been so egregiously assaulted as to merit the killing of the trappers. However, it would be only a short time later when that same chief, having re-engaged in trading with the trapping party, was himself offended. The two conflicting accounts of what happened next are as follows. In the Umpqua's recounting, the chief in question thought it would be greatly amusing to ride about the camp on one of the fine mounts in possession of the trappers. The trapper who owned the horse ordered him off at gunpoint, and a fight then and there was narrowly avoided. In the trapper's account, the chief was in no uncertain terms directed to dismount, but no kind of firearm was brandished. Despite the disparity in accounts, in either case, an immediate confrontation was avoided. The Umpqua met again across the river and decided that immediate retribution was still not the most prudent answer, and so the auspices of normality with the trappers should be maintained. Hence, the Umpqua who had agreed to guide Smith and his cohorts upriver agreed to stay at the campsite with them in order to leave the next morning. Before his companions left, though, plans were made for exacting the revenge the Umpquas felt to be rightfully theirs. Ostensible agreements were made to resume trading the next day, and the trappers fell into preparing their meals and readying themselves for a night's sleep. Jedediah Smith had his suspicions as to the Umpqua's intent, but could do little more than feign normality and carry on with the evening's tasks. With his small force against the several dozen Umpqua, here in the middle of nowhere, any attempt at an offensive attack would likely result in their small party being overrun. Though there is no record of it, Smith may have conferred with his more senior party members as to the most plausible courses of action. But no determined defensive plan was set in place, nor were the men notified of any suspected heightened threat. However, the next morning, as Smith and company warily paddled their canoe around a bend in the river and out of sight, many in the camp were still asleep. In the succeeding hour or so, many would wake up and begin their morning tasks of checking their equipment and procuring themselves some breakfast before setting about the more laborious tasks of their day. Smith, Leland, and Turner, along with their guide, carried out their intended mission of scouting out a more desirable route to travel. As they made their way back, they paddled with the vigor of men looking forward to a hearty breakfast after a hard morning's work. Then, just as they approached the bend in the river around which they had disappeared earlier that morning, they heard a riotous commotion coming from the camp, still hidden from view. As Smith, Leland, and Turner conferred with each other as to what the cause might be, the Umpqua guide snatched Smith's rifle and in one deft, intentional motion, tipped the canoe over, spilling them all into the river. The Umpqua swam to the western bank, while Smith, Leland, and Turner made it to the eastern bank, just in time to take cover from a volley of fire coming from a hidden group of Umpquas their former canoe mate had swum to for cover. They made their way to the top of a low promontory overlooking their campsite from across the river, and were greeted with a scene that must have haunted their nightmares for the remainder of their lives. All of the men in camp were now dead. Only minutes before their arrival, as their friends and comrades were still waking, a force of 200 Umpqua had overrun the camp. Some of the men had been cooking breakfast, some cleaning their weapons, and some were still asleep in their blankets when they were fell upon and cut down in a matter of minutes by Umpqua war clubs, hatchets, and arrows. Smith and company could only watch on as the aftermath unfolded, in which all of their belongings, including furs they had worked 2 years in acquiring, were either stolen or destroyed. Their livestock milled about nervously, made skittish by the sudden commotion and iron scent of blood. Eventually, they too were taken by the Umpqua. One man, Moses Black, had managed to dive into the river and escape his pursuers. According to his later account, he had been cleaning his rifle when 2 Umpqua appeared, seemingly out of nowhere, and demanded he relinquish his weapon to them. Black had refused, and after a short tussle, he had turned and ran after being slashed across the back by the Umpqua's knives. He had managed to jump into the river and avoid the arrows and rocks that rained down around him, making it to the eastern bank of the river and escaping. On his flight to the river, he had seen Thomas Virgin being hacked to pieces by a pair of Umpqua warriors, and another trapper, whom he believed to be Thomas Dawes, being chased down by a group of Umpqua in a canoe. Smith, Leland, and Turner, however, had no knowledge of Black's escape, and thus both parties, Smith and company as well as Moses Black, believed themselves to be the sole survivors of the massacre. However, regardless of their communication breakdown, the only viable destination for any trapper lost in that hostile country was to make their way north, as the party had originally intended, to Fort Vancouver. A tortuous hike of roughly 200 miles up rocky shoreline and through unforgiving woodlands that would be incredibly taxing for even fit, well-fed individuals. It would not be until August 8th that Moses Black would struggle to the gates of Fort Vancouver. He was half dead and being nearly carried by a kindly Tillamook native who had taken it upon himself to guide the starving, desperate man to his destination. At first, Black could not bring himself to speak, so shaken were his nerves. The commander of the fort ordered the gates opened and for the clearly traumatized man to be brought in and cared for. After being wrapped in blankets and given a warm drink, Black was able to still his nerves long enough to articulate the horrors of his plight. A retributive excursion was immediately planned by the fort's commander, Captain John McLaughlin. Runners were sent out to the surrounding tribes, notifying them that a handsome reward would be paid to any natives who brought in survivors of the recently perpetrated massacre. The next day at around noon, Smith, Leland, and Turner staggered to the gates of the fort, themselves in little better condition than Moses Black. They too had procured Tillamook guides after making their way roughly 120 miles up the coast. Though both Black and Smith's party were all thrilled to learn that they were not, in fact, the sole survivors of the massacre, their cross-referencing of accounts also confirmed the sad truth that there were no other survivors. This, as in so much of the history of the Old West, is also a matter of some dispute in differing accounts. Umpqua accounts speak of 2 native women who were traveling with the party and were left unharmed, even eventually marrying into the tribe. Though they were not mentioned in any of Smith's journal entries, nor in the accounts of his contemporaries, that does not mean the Umpqua accounts were untrue. It would not have been uncommon for parties of trappers to provide either employment or safe travel to local tribespeople as their comparatively sizable and well-armed contingent made their way through the territory. However, we do know that every single trapper present, other than Smith, Leland, Turner, and Black, was killed there at the campsite on the Umpqua River. Their names were Thomas Dawes, John Gaither, Abraham LaPlante, Emmanuel Lazarus, Touchant Marichal, Martin McCoy, Joseph Palmer, Peter Ranney, Harrison Rogers, Charles Swift, Thomas Virgin, a former slave known as Ranza, and perhaps most tragically, Marion, the Indian boy whom they had taken into their party, by some accounts forcefully, in order to provide him with either protection, use him for labor, or both. All died tragically violent, terrifying deaths under a dark forest canopy, thousands of miles from most of their homes. Smith left only 2 written accounts of the attack, one to his brother and another to William Clark. Both are relatively terse in nature, and though sorrow is undoubtedly expressed on Smith's behalf, the veneer of his imperturbability remained uncracked. Undoubtedly, though, Smith and the other survivors were all psychologically traumatized and burning for revenge. Smith was informed by a sympathetic Captain McLaughlin that all would be done within his power to restore what property he could of Smith's, but that marshaling an all-out assault on the Umpquas was highly imprudent and thus out of the question. Crestfallen and physically depleted, Smith, Black, Leland, and Turner would eventually recover enough to make their way southeast to the yearly Mountain Man Rendezvous in present-day Wyoming. Smith would eventually make his way back to St. Louis, and after a short-lived retirement from the mountain man life, find himself on the Cimarron River in present-day Kansas. It would be here, in 1831, that Jedediah Smith, legendary mountain man, would meet his end at the hands of the dreaded Comanche. But that, like the plethora of other harrowing stories from Jed Smith's short but remarkable 32-year life, is another story for another time.
Thank you again for joining us on this episode of History at the OK Corral. Be sure to click the like button, share this episode with a friend, and become a subscriber. Also, if you'd like to support our work and gain early access to episodes as well as ad-free viewing, you can become a member of this channel by clicking on the join button down below. Also, be sure to follow us on TikTok and Instagram and subscribe to our newsletter. Thanks again for watching, and we'll see you next time on History at the OK Corral, home of history's greatest shootouts and showdowns.